Good afternoon, good morning. Hey, what's good? It is so good to be with you today. Usually, we bring you our episode, our podcast of What's the Message on Thursdays at 11 a.m. But we have a special episode for you today. We are so excited. We've got Dr. Christina Wells. We've got Pastor Marquise Johns. We've got Pastor Michael Kelly. And I'm telling you, we are going to have an amazing conversation today. All right. I am particularly excited about this conversation because there have been a number of states who have been reporting on not just the race of confirmed cases, but they are also now reporting on the race of those who have died from coronavirus. And so I know my family is from the South Side of Chicago. So when I heard that Dr. Wells is down there doing work on the South Side, I said, that's the best side. I said, that's what's up. I appreciate it. And so really, I saw a really cool statistic on social media that was talking about how 68% of coronavirus cases in Chi-Town are African American. And so I'm sure that there's a possibility that stat has changed. It has gone up. But either way, we really just need to have a conversation about this virus and about how it is impacting our communities. It's not even just Chicago. Flint and Detroit are also brand new hotspots. And Baltimore is becoming one as well. And so how is coronavirus impacting African Americans? How is it affecting those who are living in disadvantaged and disenfranchised socioeconomic and racial positions? And so we're excited to hear from her. She is a physician working at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And so really excited for you to meet her and engage with her. I'm also excited to get you guys hearing and listening to Pastor Michael Kelly. He is the lead pastor of the Mount Rubidoux SDA Church in Riverside, California. They are doing some really great stuff in the community. They've caused their church to become essential because they actually serve every day out there. And so it'll be interesting to hear what they're doing and how they're doing it. And of course, I'm excited to have my friend, my brother, Evangelist Marquise Johns. He is the new director for Adventist Community Services and Prison Ministries for the Southeastern Conference of California, Southeastern California Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. And so I'm excited to kind of hear his thoughts as well. He has also always been passionate about community engagement and what it means to actually reflect and demonstrate the love of God and not just talk about it. And so I think that hearing from these three individuals is just going to be educational and empowering. And you guys are just going to absolutely love it. All right. So, oh my goodness, I can't believe I almost forgot. Of course, you have your host, myself, Claudia. But most importantly, we've got my partner, my chief, my what else do I call you, man? My editor-in-chief, my commander-in-chief, this is the boss lady herself, Carmela Monk Crawford. This is the shawty that I do everything with. All right. And so I'm telling you, she is going to put her journalist lawyer hat on today, and we're just going to have a good time. All right. So welcome to What's the Message, where we bring you the hope in the headlines. And as usual, I'm going to go ahead and toss it to my girl, Carmela, for our first segment with Dr. Christina Wells.
All the love back at you, Claudia. You know you are a girl. We appreciate you. It's so good. I was listening to you build this thing up. I'm like, I don't know about the word cool statistic. The statistics coming out of each one of these major urban hotspots are alarming. Today, where we wake up where the wind is blowing ice cold air. We saw snow flurries here in Maryland. When we have hailstorms, this truly feels like a momentous moment in history. This is frightening, the level of the pandemic, that has spread so far, so wide, so quickly, and has shut so many things down. And so we are fortunate at Message to have the help and the insight of Dr. Christina Wells there, who has been working. And I sure would just like to know from your personal perspective, what your life has been like in the last few weeks as you're dealing with this. And are you seeing patients amid this? How are you staying safe? What are you observing that maybe we're not seeing on the news?
Well, I work for a FQHC, which is actually a community clinic of the University of Illinois. And one of the great things is that what we've seen in the city of Chicago is that these community clinics, some of them have not been able to stay open during this time. So we're fortunate that we've been able to be open to provide access of care to the members of our community. We've had one of the things is that there, especially in the beginning, we're kind of learning as we go. And so with the unknown creates a lot of fears. One of the things that I think when we started off, we saw that there was a lot of misinformation. Maybe people in our community didn't feel that this was something that was going to impact us. So there's fears in the community, there's fears in the health center itself regarding how to get this, how to keep yourself safe. We've been doing, in our particular area, we've been doing a pretty good job of being able to keep people safe. People have been getting sick and coming in contact with positive exposures. But we've been doing a pretty good job of we haven't had any issues with running out of PPE, which is personal protective equipment, like you may have seen in other areas. So that's one of the good things. We haven't had to worry about that at this time. We're doing pretty good at the University of Illinois, and especially at my site at Miles Square, where we haven't had those issues.
Now, Doctor, one thing that I find is so interesting, this story about this coronavirus pandemic has taken on so many different racial and ethnic colors, if I can play on words, terrible, but anyway, so many different implications about that since this came out. First, there was the idea or the origination story. Right. And we've talked about that before, Claudia, the origination story about how this came from the Wuhan province in China, how this came through the eating of certain animals in an open air market. Correct. That some folks eat. And then we find, although our nation was slow on the uptick to recognize the threat, then we see travel restricted for people coming from China, when only in the last week, researchers have uncovered that the entrance of COVID-19 into the United States came from European travelers. And so there's been misinformation. Early on, we were half joking because many people thought that African Americans couldn't get it because they hadn't heard that many. Now, in your city alone, I was looking today, in Chicago, the deaths are amazing. 70% of the morbidity around COVID-19 is among African Americans. And we were reading this week about how African Americans are more vulnerable. Why is it now, again, Dr. Wells, that African Americans are getting hit harder?
I think that there's always been inequalities in terms of African Americans and in healthcare. So in Chicago, you're right. In Chicago, African Americans represent only 30% of the population. However, they are more than 50% of the positive cases and greater than 70% of the deaths, which is staggering. So part of it is that some of the things that we found is that some of, again, the misinformation that was going out, also the staggering rates of chronic illness that exists in the African American community. We know that we're typically plagued with things like diabetes, high blood pressure, COPD, and asthma. And those people
Mm-hmm.
are being more impacted by this coronavirus because their immune systems are weaker and they are not as able to fight it off. And so, because of the history of increased risk for chronic illnesses, that's been an issue. Other things we've seen is that people in the African American community may be workers in service areas, transportation, grocery stores. So they may not have the ability to work from home. Then with that, they also may be using public transportation. And so
Yeah.
social distancing may be more difficult for them.
Yeah, can I stop you right there? I think that's very interesting that the idea that social distancing is pretty much a luxury for some
Absolutely.
people. Only if
Mhm.
you live in an environment or a community, maybe the suburbs, or you have a little more, you don't have to ride the public transportation. I'm looking online and I'm seeing these stories where people are still out in the streets going to work or doing what they're doing. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's people still have to make a living. People still
Mhm.
have to eat. Food insecurity is an issue. And so these are things that people are still dealing with. Also, you may have homes where there may be multiple families living or multiple members of the family living in the same home. And so again, I had a patient who she was traveling recently and she came back and she developed some symptoms, and then but in her home she has a sister, she has a child, she has an elderly father. So when we were asking her to self quarantine, it became difficult because everybody else was going to be impacted by that. And so social distancing may become difficult in some families or people who work in certain service lines. I know just today they started making some new guidelines for people riding buses
Mm.
to keep them safer. But again, people may not have the luxury of being able to get in their own personal car and travel to and from work.
Hmm.
Right.
The thing that about, and Claudia, I'm sorry, you can just jump in because I'm I'm so interested in what she's talking about in Chicago. The thing that is also worrying to me are the stories that we're seeing that people, and sadly, I know of a case. Somebody told me about this just this week, where you know, dad in the family had not been feeling up to par, but he was still working, he was still going everywhere. And by the time he got to the hospital, he walked in, went to through the emergency room, and they immediately intubated him, and the family never saw him again. He died.
Some of that can be because I even had a patient yesterday. I was talking to her, and sometimes patients are fearful of going to the emergency room, or again, not seeking care in the right amount of time. The issue with with COVID-19 is that people can have mild symptoms, but don't realize that their O2 saturations are dropping rapidly. So by the
Mm.
time that they get to the emergency room, then they're crashing. And so
Mm.
that's why we're advising people, don't wait. If you start developing some mild symptoms, you need to seek care as soon as possible. But again, part of that is people are now also fearful about going to the emergency room, how they're going to get there, the exposures that they're going to have. And
Mm.
there's also, we're only testing people who are symptomatic. So even if you come into contact with someone who has been exposed or tested positive, there's just not enough testing kits to be able to test everyone. And the other thing that we find is that these testing sites may not always be in communities of color where they have access to it.
Oh my
So,
goodness.
are you actually seeing any disparities in giving out tests based on race, the care that maybe poor African American patients are receiving on the South Side in comparison to, let's say, maybe professors and faculty from UIC or any other of the local kind of more privileged professions and spaces out there?
Well, of course, where I work at on the South Side, we test people if they are symptomatic and fit the criteria. And it has nothing to do with their racial background, their socioeconomic status, or anything like that. But the key is patients having that information to know to come in, to know when to come in, to not try to manage things at home. Patients may have with the Affordable Care Act, we saw that more people are having access to care, but they may not have gotten connected with a PCP or known how to do that. So the lack of education and the health illiteracy that exists within the community may be also preventing people from coming in. I was speaking with a colleague yesterday. We had a meeting, and we were saying how in our communities, we have billboards that advertise all types of things, entertainment, alcohol, different things, but we need educational billboards, things that are going to provide education to our communities to help them to understand how to access care, what to do if you don't have a PCP, so that they know how to get the care that they need.
What do you think what is that education? Like, what is it that, if you could tell, if there was a list of the top 3 or the top 5 things, or something that you could share really quickly, what do you feel is needed in our communities to know the most?
I think understanding what health is and how it impacts you. I have a lot of patients who, and the understanding too about chronic illnesses. So many people, come to the doctor and they may get educated about chronic illnesses, but not understand how that truly impacts them in an individual way. And the other thing we have to understand that too is a patient may come in, but if they go home and they don't have the money to pay for their medications, or if they don't have access to healthy foods, then they still may not be able to manage their chronic illnesses. And so I think education about how do I manage my chronic illness? How do I have resources if I can't pay for my medications? How do I access healthy foods? How do I understand what to eat and how to eat to make my chronic illness stable or improve it?
I know we only have a few minutes left with you, Dr. Wells, but one thing that you've been writing for us in the last couple of issues, and that's just your bit number one, that your interest in access to care, interest in prevention, and you've written for us several times about the idea of sort of the laws of health, really, and how to even consider those amid this pandemic. Does that have any value in this discussion right now? Is there anything, because I'm trying to figure out where is the hope in this? Once again, African American people, and this is hurtful to us, as we see, whether it's New Orleans, Milwaukee, as Claudia said, Detroit, Chicago, high death rates among people who get this, if we're in close proximity. There's got to be something that we can encourage and we can do.
Yeah, I think now is the time for us to really advocate for our communities. We have to, it's no more like status quo, like letting things just go. We have to look. I was at a restaurant the other night and talking with someone who has a vegetarian restaurant in the community, which is awesome. Across the street is a liquor store. So you can find liquor stores on every corner, but you can't find grocery stores. People may have to travel miles to get to the grocery store. So now we have to advocate for our communities. We have to say, we deserve better in our communities. We want grocery stores. We want access to them in our communities. We want places where we can get healthy foods. If we're gonna have stores on the corner, we want them to be filled with healthy foods, healthy options, and resources for people in our communities. We have to share the health message because, again, boosting your immunity, building up your body and preventing and controlling chronic illnesses is important in times like this. So we have to share with people, how do they get healthy? How do they stay healthy? So sharing the health message that God has given us is even more important during these times. Giving them hope to behind that message, that there is a God who loves them, who hears them, and who's there for them, to know that he is going to bring us through this.
Mm-hmm.
That's almost like perfect, Dr. Wells. I mean, just thank you so much, because I completely agree with you. I just feel like so many of our communities are scarred by the medical field because of past experiences and whatnot. And there is so much negativity just going on social media right now, just about the racial disparities within the healthcare system. And so to have a healthcare professional come on and say, hey, you know what, on the South Side, we're not doing that. We've got clinics that are specifically catering to the health needs of people of color, but then to also kind of encourage us to continue to do that advocacy work, to continue to try to ensure that we've got the grocery stores, we've got people that are trying to connect persons to proper personal physicians. We've got individuals that are saying, you know what, it's not okay for Black people to not have health insurance. It's not okay for Black people to not have access to good health care. It's not okay for us to even espouse these kinds of rhetorical statements that we cannot get COVID-19. But instead, for us to understand that we are susceptible and vulnerable people just as much as any other person. And we are in need of proper and equal and equitable healthcare treatment. And so I just want to thank you so much for being on the front lines. I feel like, just that spotlight you made on advocacy work is the perfect transition for us to go into our second segment. Carmela, go.
Before you go,
Yeah.
Not everybody knows what the health message is, and not everybody knows. And your last article, and I want to just real quickly, because you wrote that article, it helped me, spot me if I miss anything, because since you wrote that, we've been getting our exercise, we've been out in the fresh air, we've been getting the sunshine, all that build the immunity, we've been getting sleep. Right?
Yeah.
We've been, what am I missing here? Water, drinking our water so that we can cleanse our body. What am I missing? Trusting in divine touch.
Trusting in God.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. What'd you say?
Good nutrition.
Eating the right vegetables and fruits and staying away from the sugar that pulls your immunity down. If you don't have health insurance, you don't have other things, you can at least do those things that are within your power. It's not a blame. Our people are sitting ducks for the larger systems of society in areas where things are mapped in and locked in, and you got your food deserts and things like this. But there is a measure of things that you can take control of. And I guess I just want to leave with that, because she mentioned that health message. Thank you so much.
No, I appreciate it. And Dr. Wells had mentioned this before as well, because I completely agree with you guys. If I go into the grocery store right now, the fruit, the vegetables, the meat, well, maybe not necessarily the meat, but the fruit and the vegetables are still present and accounted for.
Yes, they are.
All right. You know what I mean? The chips are gone, the popcorn is out, and I can't find my flavor of Pop-Tart. But at the end of the day, the grapes and the oranges are still there. And so just like you guys are saying, what we need to actually be healthy and to actually build and boost our immune systems is not Lay's potato chips and Ruffles, Doritos and Cheetos. It is fresh fruit, water, and the like. So we really need to not just encourage people to change their diet and to eat like this, but to continue to advocate so that grocery stores with that kind of produce is available to our communities. Because if you are in a food desert on the South Side of Chicago, and you cannot get access to that, what you've got is a 7-Eleven, then, you're going to get what you can have access to. And so we've got to make sure that we're not just advocating for community gardens and things like that, but that we're actually going to the town halls in our communities and saying, hey, there needs to be a grocery store here. I know whatever fear you might have about looting, loitering, vandalism, theft, etc. But we're saying that we have petitioned and worked with the community, and the community is saying we want a grocery store. And so if that community is saying that this is what we need, this is what we want, then that community is not going to destroy the very thing that they're asking for. And so I think that's a huge message that we can definitely leave with our viewers, for sure.
Yeah. Right.
Thanks so much, Dr. Wells. We definitely are looking forward to your article and potentially having even more conversations with you in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That being said, friends, I am excited that we can now transition into our next conversation. We have Pastor Michael Kelly, senior pastor from the Mount Rubidoux SDA Church. And we've got Evangelist Marquise Johns, who is the new director for Adventist Community Services, as well as prison ministry. So guys, come on through, turn your video and your audio on, because I got some questions. We got some things to talk about, okay? Mm-hmm. And I'm gonna just start off like this, and then, maybe we can end with, some of the things you guys are actually doing. But I saw the man from My Pillow get on the president's daily briefing, and he turned to him and said, "Hey, man, do you mind if I just tell the people to return to God and to repent, and just let me pray over the saints real quick?" And I was just like, what's happening? Is there some, and then on top of that, I've also just been hearing, I think Carmela even brought this up to me. It's fascinating, the religious liberty conversations that are potentially being had at this time, right? So many churches are actually closing down, but people are potentially saying, this is problematic. You are now infringing upon my constitutional right to worship under the dictates of my own conscience. And so you are not allowing me to do that. And then to top it all off, we've got Kenny Copeland blowing the wind of God onto COVID. We've got people just declaring the blood of Jesus onto Corona. And so I'm just wondering, man, y'all just need to help me figure this out, because I don't know if my faith is messed up, if I'm in a religious liberty crisis, or if I just need to better understand the power of the God that we serve. So what's going on, guys?
Well, the first thing I want to say is, I was listening earlier, and you said something strange. Pastor Kelly, I don't know if you caught it. She said, South side is the best side. Like, that don't even rhyme. That literally doesn't even rhyme. It is West side is the best side. I wish I had a church this morning. I just wanted to correct that. In this time of misinformation, we want to make sure that the correct information is going out across the airway.
Yeah. He's trying to come against my fake news, I guess, right?
I see.
I mean, I just want to help my sister out. My sister and my friend. I just want to help you out. But nonetheless, this is a strange time, because I think, Pastor Kelly will agree with me, and you and I spoke about this briefly, is here we are in the midst of what could be deemed the realization of the Adventist eschatology, and yet we are the most silent denomination out there. I mean, where, like you said, people who run pillow companies are being asked to pray. TD Jakes is being asked to pray, but no one is speaking to the denomination who, for the last 160 plus years, positioned ourselves as the people with the truth, or with the correct eschatology. Now, there are some people from the far right that are putting out a message of fear, not one of hope. But I do find it interesting that when you look on the national stage, what you see is everyone except for those of us who have positioned ourselves over the last 170 years as the go-to denomination for eschatology. And I find it laughable as well, but it is also concerning. And that it was funny just to see, like, the pillow guy, saying, hey, can I pray? It was interesting to see the news anchor on MSNBC asked TD Jakes and literally say this. This is the interesting thing. He literally said, as he leaned into that, was, I normally don't do this. But Bishop Jakes, can you pray for us? These are interesting times.
Well, it is interesting. I think, I don't know where you are going next with this, but I sure would like to. What if given the opportunity, what is the information that you would like to inject into this current conversation from a spiritual perspective?
Well,
For
here's the
either
thing.
one of you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I've been running my mouth. Go ahead, Pat.
No, go ahead.
My pastor is here, so I'm gonna let my pastor speak.
Please continue, man. Please continue.
I think that what we could insert into the conversation, as you guys were talking about earlier, is we have this thing called a health message. We have literature that has kind of broadcast, or if you can say that has foreshadowed some of these events and what we could do to be prepared for what's happening. What I would like to interject into the conversation is hope, right? Mm-hmm. It is definitely life altering to see that. I was looking at the statistics last night, and on March 19th or March 19th, when we declared March 13th, excuse me, when we declared a national emergency, the death toll was only 51. And here we are at less than 30 days away from that, and the death toll is already over 17,000. That is frightening. That is concerning. Mm-hmm. But I think something that we could do to infuse hope into the situation is to say that the number of people who contract COVID and recover, that's not being given as much airtime. The people who, the people who have COVID-19 and, like I said, recover, but also the fact that there are the amount of people who are dying from it are relatively low. And I know we don't want to say, hey, death is a good thing, but these are some of the things that we can infuse into the conversation to stem the tide of fear mongering that's happening, whether it's on MSNBC, CNN. Yeah. And we have to understand that news often sensationalizes the negative because they're looking for sound bites. And I think that if we had a seat at the table, we could be infusing hope by way of our health message. My pastor is working out, making sure he's eating right, breathing that message onto our church. We could be talking about our health message. We could talk about the hope that we do see a large proportion of those who are contracting COVID-19, recovering from it. And we could continue to, while we put those numbers up there, 1.6 million people have it and 97,000 have died. We could also be talking about the recovery rate and the people who have gone into hospitals that have been able to go back home and assume their relatively normal lives. That's some of the things I think could be infused into the conversation.
No, that's good. That's good, Keith. And I definitely agree with that. I guess I'm wondering, Pastor Kelly, I feel like just what Marquise is talking about, or Pastor Johns is talking about in terms of the fear and all of that, I feel like that's also causing people to try to exercise their faith in ways that if you're not in a Christian community, if you're not a person of faith, it almost seems like foolishness, and it almost looks kind of crazy, or reckless, in the sense of, people keeping their doors open, people just thinking that, hey, if I pray and if I put Jesus's blood and his name on it, then I won't get it. Like how would you respond to something like that? What are your thoughts on how that's going around?
Yeah, first of all, Carmela, you got the Iron Man in the background, so you're already a fan for me.
Can you see Iron Man? I got Hulk on this side.
Yeah, that's what's up. I think as it relates to Adventism, particularly with this idea of faith, there's a very unique opportunity to be the leaders. So many times in this, in these crazy times that take place, our eschatology, we look at things that happen and we say, okay, Jesus is coming soon. And so we want to, preach, the prophecy. And then that's where you get into the, don't close my doors and so on and so forth. But I think what's so funny is we forget that a huge part of Jesus's end time eschatological message is Matthew 24 and 25, where he really talks about how the separation of sheep from goats are those who are there to take care of the less fortunate. Those who are able to be that, like, that's literally a part of end time prophecy, is God's end time people actually being of service to those who are in need. So really, I almost feel like this COVID-19 Not, of course, we know God did not, make this take place. Obviously, he permits things to happen, but it's almost like God is throwing the church in alley-oop. But instead of us like, we want to try and turn it into something else. Look, y'all, get your life right. Don't worry, don't close our church, as opposed to saying, look, we don't need this building. Our sermon is not going to simply be, get your life right, Jesus is coming. Our sermon is going to be, you need masks. Our sermon is going to be, do you guys need food? Our sermon is going to be, can we get you some testing? So then, when this thing does boil over, or if it transitions into something else, we've already planted kingdom seeds in their lives, not necessarily from Bible studies and those different kinds of things, which I'm not saying there's anything, wrong with that, but I'll be honest, like right now, some people can't receive a Bible study because they're worried about contracting something. Right now, people are just like, I can't get to the grocery store, but now you turned your church into a grocery store. So I think when people start to see that kind of faith, it balances out this other conversation and kind of gets to the way where we're like, don't you worry about COVID, we can still be in church. Because if you notice, all of these talks about worried about closing down and taking away my right is because you're so attached to doing your Christianity that way, as opposed to understanding that you have not taken away my right to worship. I just had a worship experience communion online with my church last night. You didn't take that away. The only thing you not allowed me to do is meet inside the building. You haven't taken away my ability to serve. You haven't taken away my ability to do what Matthew 25 says. You haven't taken away my ability to have intimacy with Jesus. So I think that's what's very interesting about some of the opportunities we kind of missed out on.
Right there, Pastor Kelly just laid out some of the legal analysis that many people are visiting. And truly, the American Bar Association has I'm looking online, I'm following all this stuff. They have a webinar coming up next Monday, because those are all the questions. Are you only closing down religious entities and not other people? What are the restrictions for religious entities that may not apply to a business entity? And is this, or are the guidelines coming from the government neutral? And they basically are, because this is a health issue. What you say is correct. This is not something that was directed at our worship. This is not something that is directed at our conscience. This is something directed at health. And I think this is a good time to consider, how do we model both good citizenship and good health practices, bringing what we have into the situation, rather than fighting over the building and the structure. I really appreciate what you're just saying.
No, absolutely. Go ahead, Kelly.
No, I think that's because for so long, Adventism even has spoken. And I'm speaking of Adventism because that's my context of which I minister. But I think so long, we've talked about this concept that in the last days, they're not going to allow us to worship. And so at the first sign of something that kind of looks like that, we assume that it's this. And this isn't persecution, because we're still able to do that. What I think this has just done is said that our reasonable form of worship now has to go beyond the building. What church is, which it should have been anyway. I mean, if you study the Gospels, you don't see most of the Gospels of Jesus inside of a church building. You actually see Jesus doing a lot more of what we're doing now, just trying to connect with people and build people's lives back up, and still, of course, be able to give them a message. So, in a strange way, I think Adventism in particular needed this, because a lot of people's ministries, I hate to say it, got exposed for what is really missing. So we can grow from this if we jump on it.
Claudia, I don't even think, did we talk about specifically what it is you all are doing right now and how that came to happen?
I'm blessed, Marquise is my dude. That's my boy. So I'm glad when he moved back out here, getting LA back into California. It just so happened that he also not only the conference evangelist, but over, community services. And so I like the way he says that his reasonable services, that's my boy. So I would not expect him to attend any other church. Like I'd be offended by that.
Goodness.
And he's a pastor, so we get free labor from him because the conference pays for him, right?
Absolutely. Listen, milk that joy.
Bonus.
Yeah.
But I am going to say what I love about Mount Rubidoux, and I'll show you how this ties in. Our mission was never meant to be confined to a building. So when the COVID-19 hits, it was a very easy transition to continue to minister in the way that we've been ministering, with just making a few adjustments, because we're not married to a form, we're married to a function. And so now that the form has just changed, the function has continued. And so, I asked Marquise, I said, man, not only you over Adventist Community Services, but man, can you just really lead out in, our mission is intimacy with God, fellowship with believers, influence with our community, love, grow, serve. So I said, man, can you just take the serve aspect and just work with the team that we already have and just, provide some more leadership to them. And so we did, and that's where, we came up with the drive-throughs. The cool thing, we already have a mini grocery store after church every week anyway. Now we just changed the form and made it a drive-through for people. So Marquise has done an incredible job at just, leading out in that, organizing that. And so it's just been awesome.
But I think that I want to echo what Pastor Kelly just said is Mount Rubidoux already had that infrastructure in place, to be honest. And this is what I shared with Claudia when we had our conversation. I was like, I really didn't have to do anything, just tweaked a couple of things based on some of the mandates that were being given out by our governor here, which my pastor was on the phone arguing on our behalf when Governor Newsom was handing out these new edicts, et cetera, et cetera. But the infrastructure was already there. There's a wonderful lady by the name of Faye, who's been running the community services department at Mount Rubidoux for years. Again, turning the church into a virtual grocery store. The head deacon, while he is in charge of the facilities and doing these things, Brother Victor, he was going to different food venues and getting the food and then distributing that on Sabbath. So the reality is, Pastor Kelly is correct. The infrastructure was there. They were already about it. And that's the thing that we're not trying to come down on anybody, but the reality is many churches were limited to being talking heads. And there was this adage or this conversation that was circled through many of our churches that if your church disappear tomorrow, would it be missed? And we saw the realization of that. We saw that many churches were not missed because they were only open once a week for someone to disseminate a sermon. Whereas without even having to promote it, people lined up at Mount Rubidoux to get what they had been getting for weeks and months and years before the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I just want to again echo that sentiment that what was going on at Rubidoux was something that was already there. And as my pastor pointed out, we are always focused on the end times, Jesus coming, the persecution, but we overlook, and again, speaking to our context of Seventh-day Adventists, we overlook things that Ellen White talked about in terms of the health message being the final word. She literally talked about the fact that if we got familiar with disease, its causes, prevention, and cure, we would find a field of labor any and everywhere. And that would be irrespective of if there was a pandemic or not. If we made ourselves familiar with disease, with the cure, etc., which is a part of the Advent message, just like, oh my God, Jesus is coming and there's going to be a law that keeps us from going to buildings. If we had familiarized ourselves with those we would find work. And that's what I think Rubidoux has done. It has familiarized itself with the needs of its community. And therefore, when this thing hit, they were already positioned to meet needs and not just to be talking heads.
Yeah, absolutely.
Energized.
No.
I want to okay, real quick.
No, go ahead.
You were talking about these directives coming down from the governor, and you said you were on the phone with the governor about this?
My pastor was.
Yeah. So
literally talking to the governor.
Yeah, so he got all the faith leaders together. I just happened to, when I use the word inside track, there's some community partnerships that I've made here in Riverside who are connected to Gavin's campaign. So I was there for his inauguration and, prayed over him, with the, prayer breakfast that he had for, a select group of faith leaders. So when these kind of things pop up, they keep me in the loop, and I'm involved on the faith-based team that he has, accumulated and put together to support. So it's been an honor to do that. And just, to be able to hear how he has a very strong heart for the faith-based community. Like he really, really does, to be able to make it. As a matter of fact, one of the things that he made very clear is that faith-based communities are essential, but essential when they're doing this kind of work, right?
Yeah.
Because this is what you guys do. And so the people who can't go to the grocery stores and can't afford it because of this time, because of your unique position in the community, you guys are going to help us get through this by being able to provide resources and keeping people safe by the way they do it. So.
And so when you talked to him, he was very amenable to the plans that you had then.
Well, I mean, let me be frank and clear, because I'm always going to keep it 100. It's not so much that he's like, tell me what all y'all are doing. It's pretty much like, hey, I know what faith-based churches do. And so here are the guidelines that I would love for you guys to work in. And then let's come back and talk after we see how that's been going. So I'm not going to say, of course, he's open to hear, but his thing was pretty much like, hey, we got to keep this thing safe. No gathering. You can still stream, but limited crew. But man, the real work that we need you guys to do is, can you be a help to the community by providing resources to them? So, the people who got the food banks and those different kind of things open. Riverside recently just asked us not to stream. That was because they're like, there's a very strict stay-home order for Riverside. So.
Okay. Oh, were you streaming from your church?
We were. So we would have a minimal crew go in, stream at the church. Just, because, we like the background, at least get some kind of quality. But this week I had to record a sermon. So.
Yeah. Well, you're up for it. You're up for it. Does any of this worry, or are you worried in the service that you would be subject to either health risk for you or your people and any liabilities? I mean, suppose somebody says, okay, I would love to do something like this, but what if in the serving there is risk of spread? Does that come into your...
So
yeah, go ahead, Marquise.
No. Well, so as the ACS director for Southeastern California Conference, one of the things I had to do was I had to give out guidelines on who can and who cannot serve, and the type of groups that you can pull together. So the first thing we said was no one over the age of 60. And so what I did is I said no one over the age of 59 can serve, and keep your groups to a maximum of 10 people. And so we actually had a situation down in Orange County where the ACS local director wanted to come, but it was known by the church that her daughter has a pre-existing condition. And so what I had to ask the pastor to do was I asked the pastor to send a note saying, hey, listen, because we care about you and we care about your family, we don't want you exposed and then by default exposing your daughter and thereby compromising her and her health. And so what I asked them to do was send a letter so that, unfortunately, so that we weren't liable if she chose to come anyways. We asked her, we recommended that she not, but if she chose to come, we sent a letter saying, hey, we take this thing seriously. We want to protect you. We want to protect your family. So we're asking you not to come. We can't stop you, but we're asking you not to come. That way we are protected against any liability. But then we have 44 community services centers in the Southeastern California Conference. Mount Rubidoux and several others are actually food pantries. Yeah. But what we did is we said, hey, if you're going to operate, we need no one over the age of 59, no one, and we need groups of 10 or fewer. And we want you to be strictly adhere, if you possibly can, to those social distancing guidelines. And so those are some of the things we did to make sure, or to ensure that, one, no one is compromised, no one catches this, and anyone who is already in a compromised position is not exposed or exposing any of their loved ones to COVID-19.
With those guidelines in mind, are you guys feeling like this is, yes, we want churches and we want entities to be doing this kind of community service, but are you also wondering as well, is it just not for everybody? Like, should some faith communities, should some individuals just be comfortable with hey, I cannot serve, I cannot do something right now reality.
Yeah, I think there's a principle I like to live by that Seth has shared with us as a team one time when he was working with us. He said we need to pray like everything depends on God, but work like everything depends on us. And
wow, that's good.
I think how I take that principle and apply it to this situation is say there are certain things in this pandemic that we believe the church needs to be for the community. Like the question we asked when we kind of reset our strategic plan and our 3 months priorities when this all came out is we said, who does the community need us to be? Right? Like who does do our members, and when we say community, we don't just mean outside, we include our church as a community when we use that word. And so when you think about that, you say, okay, if they need food, we're going to provide that. We're going to keep as many guidelines as we can, but we also know we're putting ourselves at risk to provide a worship experience. We're putting ourselves at risk to provide church. So what we're going to do is we're going to do everything we can. Remember, work like everything depends on us. Social distancing, minimal crew. At the same time, though, we're going to say, God, while we're doing this, not out of greed or arrogance or anything like that, we just need you to cover us because we're going to pray like everything depends on you.
Yeah, I get it.
So be smart. Now, I'm going to say this, and only God knows this. If there are some people who are trying to have these kind of worship experiences because you're worried about the offering that you're not going to get if you don't have them, I just don't know, how the Lord is going to work within that. But if you're
Pastor,
like,
Pastor,
really going to serve, I think God's going to have a covering. And I don't think that's presumptuous. And let me tell you something else we've also said. I've recognized, Adventist or non, I don't have to do it all. There are other churches in the community that are handling it. So I'm not going to put my people at risk because I know that the Grove down the street, they're doing something else so we don't have to do. We're just doing our part because we're a part of the kingdom. They're a part of the kingdom. They might not have all the information we have and so on and so forth. So I'm like, I don't need y'all to come out and do this food thing every day because there's 2 other churches down the street. They're doing this, something similar. So, we'll be all right that way.
No, Pastor Kelly, I just really appreciated that. I'm a bit over dramatic, so I had to do my little performance there. But I really appreciate that because even in our last episode last week, we talked about finance, and just according to statistics right now, over 10 million people are unemployed in the country at large. And so it's like if 10 million people are unemployed, and yet we are still trying to find ways to receive tithe and offering, I think that that's something that we all need to very critically consider, pray about. I'm never going to come on Message Magazine, clearly, and say, like, do not pay tithe. But at the same time, like, I do feel as though it is important that we get people to begin to really think through what are my bills? What is my debt? What cash flow do I even have access to before figuring out, am I still going to give my 10% and then my 5% so that they can keep the lights on, kind of a thing.
Well, see, I think this is such a huge point. I just have to drop this here. And if you haven't been doing this, it's a little too late, but this is why I think it's so important. We will go into, honestly, run our evangelistic crusades, and let's just be real with it. And y'all forgive me, y'all might not be able to rebroadcast this, but
you're good.
We will go into a poor neighborhood, baptize all these people, tell them to pay tithe, but not teach them how to budget. Like that's what we'll do. We will not try to change their economic situation by making Adventist schooling more affordable for them, but we will try to pull tithe out of them. That's the first thing. Because if we had truly in our churches, even look at the SCA manual. The SCA manual only tells you really, for all intents and purposes, to give tithe. It doesn't even tell you to give offering, which of course, is local. So what we have done is we have taught people, this is what you ought to do, give your tithe, but we haven't taught them Deuteronomy, where it talks about how to get out of debt, how to, be the lender and not the borrower. Like, we haven't taught those principles, so that if we taught people how to save, how to budget, how to manage, how to get out of debt, then when moments like this come, you don't have to worry about tithe. That's number one. Then I think number two, what we really have seen now is that in the midst of this pandemic, people are going to be giving to entities that they know are giving back to the need that is taking place around the world. So if they're like, yo, I'm just going to give tithe, what is my tithe going for? To keep the lights on in an empty building, to keep a pastor employed who really isn't doing much but standing up and preaching anyway. We just did a drive-through donation because there's a women's shelter that someone had a fever inside the shelter, so they had to kick all the women out the shelter, and they needed so many supplies. We have what is called Compassion Week, where every day during the week leading up to Easter, we have a different act of compassion. As a matter of fact, I'll put a plug in. Today, we're actually giving blood at Mount Rubidoux because Friday Jesus gave his blood, so we're giving our blood in the midst of this pandemic. But it was amazing to see people in the rain drive through, and we literally gave away thousands of items that people purchased in the midst of a pandemic because they saw where it was going. So the way that we have kind of, I think, been approaching tithe, people, yes, are going to be faithful, and I praise God for their faithfulness. I really do. But I also think people are giving because they're like, man, they see that my giving is literally being the hands and feet of Jesus and not simply being fuel to a machine that right now we see might not be running as effectively because we can't be in the building.
And while my pastor has opened the door for controversy, I think that this is an opportunity for us to look at how we are structured. For instance, I know that my pastor at this juncture and my church can do something for me, but I don't know what the conference can do for me. I don't know what the union does for me. I don't know what the division does for me. And so I think that while we have been having these conversations in the North American division and the General Conference about restructuring, I think that when we look at the overhead right now, and we don't know how long we're going to be in COVID-19, but soon the resources are going to be limited, and we're going to have to ask ourselves, do we really need a union building with several secretaries and several different directors? Do we need a conference building with several secretaries and several different directors? Now, we don't want to see anybody without work, but I think this is an opportunity for us to look at how we are structured and potentially restructuring ourselves so that more resources can get down to the local level, so that when Pastor Kelly and other churches who are doing things like this need resources, they're not looking to someone who has to say, well, how does this affect our bottom line and our ability to keep people employed? They're able to say, hey, look, that money is already accessible at the place where it's most needed, because at the union level, when nobody else has to agree with me on this, and I get it, I just recently started working for the conference, but the reality is at the conference level, no monies are generated. It is the pastor preaching a message of hope to people that infuses them with the idea that giving is something I should do to stem my selfish nature, or to curtail my selfish nature. But the conference is not doing that. The union is not doing that. The division is not doing that. And at these levels, we have so much money being poured into offices that are not affecting positively the local level, so that when we get to COVID-19, when we get to a pandemic like this, which individuals have been warning us about for years, whether you look at the Barack Obama statement, whether you look at the Bill Gates statements, where you look at any of these things, this is something that we've been warned about. And we, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, that, locally, the division is turning over some $700 million to the General Conference. The Inter-American division is turning over some $500 million to the General Conference. What could we do in this time of pandemic? A church like Rubidoux, a church like Oakwood University, a church like Emmanuel Brinklow, wherever the churches are that are giving these essential services, what could we do if we had more of those financial resources at the local level? So I believe one of the things that this pandemic is forcing us to do, or hopefully it will cause us to do, is reevaluate how we're structured and how that structure is actually benefiting our constituents and or not benefiting our constituents in situations like this. If you've been tithing faithfully for 50 years at somewhere between the neighborhood of, you make $50,000 a year. So you've been given $5,000 a year for 50 years. And right now you're out of work. Does the conference do anything to help you stay in your home, get the food you need, et cetera, et cetera? And I think that's a conversation, a question that needs to be asked and a conversation that needs to be had. And that's just my perspective.
You talk so fast. You just put us all out there. And so we thank you for that, Pastor Marquise John. What I will say, and I have to agree that this is a time in which we all have to re-examine our nimble what's the word? Nimbleness or nimbility. I don't know what the word is, but we have to be
You a doctor, you can make up a word. You're a doctor, make up a
you have
word.
to change what we're doing in order to meet the needs of people around us. I agree with you. And for me, the idea of everything that you're espousing, the principle of being able to look back at what am I doing, where am I putting my resources so that I can help the people around me, is something from an individual all the way up that should be assessed. I agree with that. I don't know, I don't know how the rest of those how the rest of that will play out. But certainly, even in within our context, within the Adventist Church, there have been in the last week the recognition that even though the federal government is offering funds, that for maybe some other churches would keep the lights on and the minister employed, the Adventist Church in North America, at least, has said we're going to forego taking those while we work through our system and make sure and know that the Lord is going to provide and continue to provide services for the people in the community. And so, that funding is a whole other layer of discussion when you're talking about religious freedom in a pandemic and service for the people in your community. It's, I really agree that we have to look at that.
Yeah,
Anyway,
man. Listen. I appreciate all y'all being on. This has been just a really great conversation. I just want to thank our viewers for joining in with us. It's very difficult, the times that we're living in, but I think the message that we have received, whether it be from Dr. Wells, Pastor Kelly, or Pastor Johns, is that it is important that we advocate for our communities. It is important that we not just be talking heads, as Pastor John said, but that we be individuals that are on the front lines, actively and very tangibly demonstrating the love and care of Jesus Christ. It's not enough for us to gather together and worship, but our congregations or our constituents or our communities are not receiving any kind of tangible transformation because of the power of the Holy Spirit. Just like, Pastor Kelly was mentioning, Matthew 24 and 25, the Holy Spirit is not coming just to be able to help me explain the 2300-day prophecy. The Holy Spirit is falling afresh simply for the purpose of me being able to meet the very real needs of people. And COVID-19 is presenting us with an opportunity to do just that. And so I want to encourage you all to really take the example that Pastor Kelly and Pastor Johnson provided through the Mount Rubidoux Sunday Adventist Church, in that it is not just something that we're going to pick up during a pandemic, but it's something that is integral to our church culture. It is central to our church mission. And so because of that, we are actively on committees, in conversations with community leaders and community associations, so that when crisis comes, we are already on the contact list. We are not actively waiting and searching for people. Who do I need to talk to help this person out? Because I kind of want to help, and I don't know how to help. Like, no, you're already present and accounted for. They already know to call you. And basically, during time when people are being deemed non-essential, you are being deemed essential. So this is our opportunity for churches, regardless of denomination, to identify ways to really stretch their hand out and reflect the very purpose and the image and ministry of Jesus Christ. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been your edition, your episode of What's the Message, where we bring you the hope in the headlines. Make sure you're following us on all social media at Message 1898, on Facebook at Message Magazine, and you can subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Okay, it is always a pleasure, always a blessing. Enjoy your Easter weekend, and we'll be back with you next week. Okay, same place, same channel, just a different topic. All right, so we'll see you there. All right, peace. Have a good one, everybody.
Pastor Kelly, Pastor John, thank you.
God bless.